Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Reading Rainbows, where we're reading Inkheart. Today's chapter is chapter 13, Capricorn's Village. But to the last question, Zelig replied, he probably flew to beyond the dark regions, where people don't go and cattle don't stray, where the sky is copper, the earth iron, and where the evil forces live under roofs of petrified toadstools and in tunnels abandoned by moles. Isaac Bashevis Singer, Naphtali the storyteller, and his horse Sus. The sun was already high in the cloudless sky when they set off. Soon the air was so hot and muggy in Elinor's car that Maggie's t-shirt was sticking to her skin with sweat. Elinor opened her window and passed a bottle of water around. She herself was wearing a knitted jacket buttoned up to her chin, and when Maggie wasn't thinking of Mo or Capricorn, she wondered whether Elinor might melt away inside it. You know, it sounds hot and all that, but at the same time, I don't know, I've heard of this sort of phenomenon where, if you wear many, many, many layers of black clothes, even out in the desert, if they're made of the right material or something, then, you're sort of insulating yourself against the heat. You keep your body temperature at, its temperature. You're not, hot and sweaty and all that. But I don't know the science behind it. I don't know what the material would have to be or anything like that. It's just something that I once heard about years ago. Dustfinger sat in the back seat, so silent you could almost have forgotten he was there. He had put Gwyn on his lap. The marten slept while Dustfinger's hands restlessly stroked his fur, passing over it again and again. Now and then Maggie turned to look at him. He was usually gazing out of the window indifferently, as if he were looking straight through the mountains and trees, houses and rocky slopes passing by outside. His expression seemed perfectly empty, as if he were thinking of something far away, and once, when Maggie glanced around, there was such sadness on his scarred face that she quickly turned to look out the windshield ahead of her. This just makes Dustfinger sound so sad and pitiful, but at the same time, knowing that he's working with Capricorn, it's hard to really feel a whole lot of pity for him. She would have liked to have an animal on her own lap during this long, long journey. Perhaps it would have driven away the dark thoughts that insisted on coming into her mind. Outside, the world was a place of gently unfolding mountains rising higher and higher. Sometimes it seemed as if they would crush the road between their gray and rocky sides, but worse than the mountains were the tunnels. Pictures seemed to lurk in them that not even Gwyn's warm body could have kept at bay. They seemed to be hiding there in the darkness, waiting for Maggie. Pictures of Mo in some grim, cold place, and of Capricorn. Maggie knew it must be Capricorn, although his face was different every time. Yeah, I know how she feels, that uncertainty, the pictures playing out in your mind over and over. Basically, you're thinking of the worst thing that could happen, how bad things can be, what you're afraid of, and it's hard to chase those thoughts and those pictures away. That's one reason why I always have a book with me, so that my mind doesn't turn to all those dark thoughts in those quiet moments. When you read a book, you lose yourself in the world of that book, and it's easier to chase the thoughts away, at least for a little while. She tried reading for a while, but soon noticed that she wasn't taking in a word of what she read, so she gave it up and stared out of the window like Dustfinger. Elinor chose minor roads without much traffic on them. Otherwise, the driving gets so boring, she said. It made no difference to Meggie. She just wanted to arrive. She looked impatiently at the mountains and the houses where other people lived. Sometimes, through the window of a car coming the other way, she caught a glimpse of a stranger's face, then it was gone, like a book you open then close at once. When they were driving through one village, she saw a man by the roadside sticking a band-aid on the grazed knee of a tearful little girl. He was stroking her hair comfortingly, and Maggie couldn't help remembering how often Mo had done that for her, how he sometimes chased all around the house, cursing when he couldn't find a band-aid in time. The memory brought tears to her eyes. "Heavens above, it's quieter in here than in a pharaoh's burial chamber," said Elinor at some point. Maggie thought she said heavens above quite a lot. "Couldn't one of you at least say something now and then? Oh, what a lovely landscape, for instance, or that's a very fine castle. If you keep as deathly quiet as this, I'll be falling asleep at the wheel any minute now." She still hadn't undone a single button of her knitted jacket. That reminds me of a road trip when I was in foster care and we were driving to Florida. And on that trip, we wound up having some car trouble. So we could keep going as long as the car stayed turned on. But if we had stopped to go to a hotel, because we were driving from northern New Jersey down to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. So, that's a good long drive. And there were, 7 of us in the car, I guess. And so, because we couldn't stop, that meant that we couldn't stop to get a hotel room or anything. So, my foster mom was determined that, we'd just drive through the night. That way we wouldn't have to call anyone to jumpstart the car or whatever. So, it's late at night. It's probably somewhere around midnight, 1 in the morning. And I want to say that we were somewhere in Georgia at the time, though I'm not positive. And, all of us girls were, either all the way asleep or nearly asleep. It was super quiet in the car, when all of a sudden my foster mom screams, "Somebody get me some chocolate! I'm gonna fall asleep." I mean, just shrieked it at the top of her lungs, waking us all up, with a start. And, so Elinor, is saying, "Heavens above, couldn't one of you at least say something now and then?" Just made me think of, my foster mom shrieking at us that we have to get her some chocolate right now or she's gonna fall asleep. I mean, I've taken a long drive by myself before. A year ago, I had gone up to New Jersey for my sister's wedding, and I wound up leaving New Jersey at about 5 p.m. to make the drive back to Tennessee. And that's a long drive, especially at night. And in the middle of the night, there's not as many cars on the road. So, there's not much to really interrupt you from just the flow of traffic and just sort of being lulled into that sense of quiet drowsiness, so to speak. But all I did was, I made sure that I had plenty of drinks with caffeine, and I blast the radio because I was the only one in the car, so it's not like I could, be bothering anyone with me blasting the radio. And that kept me awake long enough to arrive home at about 7 a.m., which is an hour earlier than the GPS predicted. "I don't see any castle," muttered Maggie, but it wasn't long before Elinor spotted one. 16th century, she announced as the ruined walls appeared on a mountainside. "Tragic story. Forbidden love, pursuit, death, grief, and pain." And as they passed between the strong and silent rock walls, Elinor told the tale of a battle that had raged in this very place over 600 years ago. To this day, if you dig among the stones, you'll still find bones and dented helmets. She seemed to know a story about every church tower. Some were so unlikely that Maggie wrinkled her brow in disbelief, and Elinor, without taking her eyes off the road, always responded, "No, really, that's just what happened." She seemed to be particularly fond of bloodthirsty stories, tales of beheading of unhappy lovers, or princes walled up alive. "Yes, everything looks very peaceful now," she remarked when Maggie turned a little pale at one of these stories. "But I can tell you there's always a sad story somewhere. Ah, well, times were more exciting a few 100 years ago." "I don't know, times are pretty exciting now, and I'd rather go back to boring." Maggie didn't know what was so exciting about times when, if Elinor was to be believed, your only choice was between dying of the plague or getting slaughtered by invading soldiers. But Elinor's cheeks glowed pink with excitement at the sight of some burnt-out old castle. Excuse me. And whenever she told tales of the warrior princes and greedy bishops who had once spread terror and death abroad in the very mountains through which they were now driving on modern paved roads, a romantic gleam lit her usually chilly pebble eyes. I don't know, this tells us quite a bit about Elinor if you stop and think about it. She seems like this, stuffy, uptight old lady, and yet her favorite stories are the ones of, bloodthirsty, warriors, princes that, get walled up alive or whatever, and it's like, I don't know, you see this little old lady and you think that she's just some stick-up-the-butt, old curmudgeon, and yet, she's got a passion for guy things, if you want to go by those stereotypical whatever. This passion for, the dirty side of history, so to speak. "My dear Elinor, you were obviously born in the wrong story," said Dustfinger at last. These were the first words he had spoken since they set out. "The wrong story? The wrong period, you mean? Yes, I've often thought so myself." "Call it what you like," said Dustfinger. "Anyway, you should get along well with Capricorn. He likes the same kinds of stories as you." "Is that supposed to be an insult?" asked Elinor, offended. The comparison seemed to trouble her, for after that she kept quiet for almost an hour, which left Maggie with nothing to distract her from the miserable thoughts and the frightening pictures they conjured up for her in every tunnel. Twilight was beginning to fall when the mountains drew back from the road and the sea suddenly appeared beyond green hills, a sea as wide as another sky. The sinking sun made it glisten like the skin of a beautiful snake. It was a long time since Maggie had seen the sea, and then it had been a cold sea, slate gray and pale from the wind. This sea looked very different. This sea looked different, very different. It warmed Maggie's heart just to see it, but all too often it disappeared behind the tall, ugly buildings covering the narrow strip of land that lay between the water and the encroaching hills. Sometimes the hills reached all the way down to the sea, and in the light of the setting sun they looked like giant waves that had rolled up onto the land. As they followed the winding coastal road, Elinor began telling stories again, tales of the Romans who, she said, had built the road they were on, and how they feared the savage inhabitants of this narrow strip of land. Maggie was only half listening. Palm trees grew beside the road, their fronds dusty and sharp-edged. Giant agaves flowered among the palms, looking like spiders squatting there with their long, spiny leaves. The light behind them turned pink and lemon yellow as the sun sank farther down toward the sea. The dark blue trickled down from the sky like ink flowing into water. It was so beautiful a sight that it almost hurt to look at. Maggie had thought the place where Capricorn lived would be quite different. Beauty and fear make uneasy companions. Yeah. It's interesting, that they have that line because, yeah, in a way it's true. When you hear about atrocities, when you hear about, all this bad stuff that happens, when you hear about bad people, you always imagine like a dark, shadowy, stormy type of setting, You don't really think of, the sun shining in a blue sky and the pretty plants and flowers around. You think of, dusty, dirty, dim. And so, in a way that just makes the bad things all the worse when you realize that, something so bad could happen in a place so good. They drove through a small town past houses as bright as if a child had painted them. They were color-washed orange and pink, red and yellow. A great many were yellow. Pale yellow, brownish yellow, sandy yellow, dirty yellow, and they had green shutters and red-brown roofs. Even the gathering twilight couldn't drain them of their brightness. "It doesn't seem so very dangerous here," remarked Maggie as they drove past another pink house. "That's because you keep looking to your left," said Dustfinger behind her. "But there's always a light side and a dark side. Look to your right for a change." Maggie did as he said. At first she saw nothing but the brightly colored houses there, too. They crowded close to the roadside, leaning against each other as if they were arm in arm. But then the houses were suddenly left behind, and steep hills with the night already settling among their folds lined the road instead. Yes, Dustfinger was right. It looked sinister over there, and the few houses left seemed to be drowning in the gathering dusk. It quickly grew darker, for night falls fast in the south, and Maggie was glad that Elinor was driving along the well-lit coastal road. But all too soon, Dustfinger told her to turn off along a minor road leading away from the coast, away from the sea and the brightly colored houses, and into the dark. The road wound further and further into the hills, going up and down as the slopes by the roadside grew steeper and steeper. The lights of the headlights fell on brambles, on vines run wild, and on olive trees crouching like bent old men beside the road. Only twice did they meet another vehicle coming toward them. Now and then the lights of a village emerged from under the darkness, but the roads along which Dustfinger guided Elinor led away from the lights and deeper into the night. Several times the beam of the headlights fell on ruined houses, but Elinor didn't know any stories about any of them. No princes had lived in those wretched hovels, no red-robed bishops, only farmers and laborers whose stories no one had written down, and now they were lost, buried under wild thyme and fast-growing spurge. Yeah, that's an interesting bit about history is, everyone knows the big names. Yeah, everyone knows, Nero and Napoleon and Hitler and Washington and, all these big names of history. But no one knows about, the common people. The people who just live their lives day to day. Not getting involved in any big uprising. Just quietly going about their lives. Living with their families. Doing their work. Keeping their heads down, basically. And those stories end up lost for forever. I mean, think about, the time of, the Romans. Think of, all the old Roman myths. And, you hear about the demigods and the gods. And, you hear about, all of that, but, you don't really hear the tale of, Peter the farmer who, had, 5 sons, and they all worked the land with him, and nothing interesting happened to them, but, they all grew up, and, each married and had 5 sons of their own, and on and on. No one hears those tales, because, there's nothing fun or exciting or interesting. It's just life as usual. So how many people have been lost to history just because they lived their ordinary lives and they weren't anyone super interesting or important? "Are we still going the right way?" asked Elinor in a muted voice, as if the world around her were too quiet for anyone to speak out loud. "Where on earth do we find a village in this god-forsaken wilderness? We've probably taken at least 2 wrong turns already." But Dustfinger only shook his head. "We're going the right way," he replied. "Once we're over that hill, you'll be able to see the houses." "I certainly hope so," muttered Elinor. "I can hardly make out the road. Heavens above, I had no idea anywhere in the world was still so dark. Couldn't you have told me what a long way it was? Then I'd have filled up the tank again. I don't even know if we've got enough gas to make it back to the coast." Here's the thing, Dustfinger says that, he doesn't really have much to do with Capricorn, etc., etc. He knows that Capricorn's got, a main place in the north and this main place in the south, and then a few little hidden hideaways and blah, 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 whatever. But, he tries to pass it off as, this is just, little bits that he knows. But, he doesn't really have much to do with Capricorn, and yet being able to find, Capricorn's main place in the south, hidden away, far from civilization, so to speak, makes it just sound like, he's gone there often, and just how often has he gone and spoken to Capricorn and do work for him? "So whose car is this?" Dustfinger snapped back. "Mine? I told you I don't know the first thing about cars. Now keep your eyes on the road. We'll be coming to the bridge any moment." "Bridge?" Elinor drove around the next bend and suddenly stamped on the brake. Right across the road, lit by 2 floodlights, was a metal barrier. It looked rusty, as if it had stood there for years. "There," said Elinor, clapping her hands on the steering wheel. "We have gone the wrong way. I told you so." "No, we haven't." Dustfinger took Gwyn off his shoulder and got out of the car. He looked around, listening intently as he approached the barrier, then dragged it over to the side of the road. Elinor's look of disbelief almost made Maggie laugh out loud. "Has the man gone right out of his mind?" she whispered. "He doesn't think I'm going to drive down a closed road in this darkness, does he?" All the same, she started the engine when Dustfinger impatiently waved her on. As soon as she was past him, he pulled the barrier back across the road. "No need to look at me like that," he said, climbing back into the car. "The barrier's always there. Capricorn had it put up to keep unwanted visitors away. Not that people often venture up here. Capricorn spreads stories around the village that keep most of them at a distance, but—" "What kind of stories?" Maggie interrupted him, although she didn't think she really wanted to know. "Blood-curdling stories," said Dustfinger. "Like most folk, the locals around here are superstitious. The most common tale is that the devil himself lives on the far side of that hill." Maggie was angry with herself for being scared, but now she just couldn't take her eyes off the dark hilltop. "Mo says human beings invented the devil," she said. "Well, maybe." Dustfinger's mysterious smile was hovering around his mouth again. "But you wanted to know about the stories. They say no bullet can kill the men who live in that village. They can walk through walls, that they That they kidnap 3 boys every month when the moon is new, and Capricorn teaches them to commit theft, arson, and murder. I wonder how much of this is really just stories, though. I mean, yeah, from the descriptions of Capricorn that we've heard, I wouldn't put it past him to kidnap 3 boys a month, and teach them, theft, arson, and murder. Excuse me. Good heavens, who thought all that up? The folk of these parts or this man Capricorn himself? Elinor was leaning right over the steering wheel. The road was full of potholes, and she had to drive very slowly so as not to get stuck. Both. Dustfinger leaned back and let Gwyn nibble his fingers. Capricorn rewards people who think up new stories. The one man who never joins in that game is Basta. He's so superstitious himself, he even goes out of his way to avoid black cats. Now that's just sad. Black cats are awesome. Black cats are love. Black cats are not evil. It won't give you bad luck. Yeah. Most black cats that I've met, the only thing they'll give you is nibbles and purrs and kisses. All they want is love. You're making me sad, hating against black cats. Basta. Maggie remembered the name, but before she could ask any more questions, Dustfinger was speaking again. He seemed to enjoy telling these tales. Oh yes, I almost forgot. Of course everyone living in the village of the damned has the evil eye, even the women. The evil eye? That's right. One glance and you fall mortally ill. 3 days after that at the latest, and you're dead as a doornail. Who'd believe a thing like that? Murmured Maggie, turning to look ahead of her again. Idiots would. Elinor stamped on the brake again. The car skidded over gravel on the road. The bridge Dustfinger had mentioned lay ahead, its gray stone pale in the headlights. Go on, said Dustfinger impatiently. It'll hold, though you might not think so. It looks as if the ancient Romans built it, muttered Elinor, but for donkeys, not cars. Even if the ancient Romans built it, in the centuries since that and before Capricorn's men moved in, it would have had some upkeep. All the same, Elinor drove on. Maggie squeezed her eyes shut tight and didn't open them until she could hear the gravel under the car tires once more. Capricorn likes this bridge a lot, said Dustfinger quietly. A single well-armed man is enough to make it impassable. But luckily he doesn't post a guard here every night. Dustfinger, Maggie turned hesitantly to look at him as Elinor's car labored up the last hill. What are we going to say when they ask us how we found the village? I mean, it's not going to be a good idea for Capricorn to know that you showed us the way, is it? No, you're right, muttered Dustfinger, avoiding Maggie's eyes, although we are bringing him the book. He picked up Gwyn, who was clambering around the back seat, held him so that he couldn't snap, and then lured him into the backpack with a piece of bread. The marten had been restless ever since darkness fell. He wanted to go hunting. They had reached the top of the hill. The world around them had disappeared from view, swallowed up by the night, but not far away a few pale rectangles glowed in the dark, lighted windows. There it is, said Dustfinger. Capricorn's village, or the Devil's village if you prefer. He laughed softly. I think Dustfinger's having a little too much fun with, all the superstitions that surround that village and trying to scare Maggie and Elinor. Elinor turned to him crossly. For heaven's sake, will you stop that? She snapped at him. You really seem to like these stories. You see, even Elinor agrees with me. Who knows, perhaps they're all your own invention and this Capricorn is just a rather eccentric book collector. Dustfinger made no reply, but only looked out of the window with the strange smile that Maggie sometimes wanted to wipe off his face. Yet again it seemed to be saying, "How stupid you two are." Elinor had switched off the engine. The silence surrounding them was so absolute that Maggie hardly dared to breathe. She looked down at the lighted windows. Usually she thought brightly lit windows were an inviting sight in the dark, but these seemed to be far more menacing than the darkness all around. "Does this village have any normal inhabitants?" asked Elinor. "Harmless old grannies, children, people who don't have anything to do with Capricorn?" "No, nobody lives here but Capricorn and his men," whispered Dustfinger, "and the women who cook and clean and so on for them." "And so on. Oh, wonderful." Gee, I wonder what "and so on" might mean. "And so on. Oh, wonderful." Elinor snorted with distaste. "I like the sound of this Capricorn less and less. Okay, let's get this over and done with. I want to go home to my books, real electric light, and a nice cup of coffee." "Really? I thought you were longing for a little adventure." If Gwyn could speak, thought Maggie, he'd do it in Dustfinger's voice. "I prefer adventures in the sunlight," replied Elinor curtly. "Heavens, how I hate this darkness. Still, if we sit around here until dawn, my books will be mildewed before Mortimer can do anything about them. How long do you think you're going to be gone? You're wanting to, get back by tomorrow sometime. Books don't mildew overnight, you Nimrod." "Maggie, go around to the back of the car and get the bag. You know the one." Maggie nodded and was just about to open the passenger door when a glaring light blinded her. Someone whose face she couldn't make out was standing beside the driver's door, shining a flashlight into the car. He tapped it commandingly against the pane. Elinor jumped in such alarm she hit her knee on the steering wheel, but she quickly pulled herself together. Cursing, she rubbed her hurt leg and opened the window. "What's the idea?" she snapped at the stranger. "Do you have to frighten us to death? A person could easily get run over skulking around in the dark like that." "Elinor, keep your mouth shut." By way of answering, the stranger pushed the barrel of a shotgun through the open window. "This is private property," he said. Maggie thought she recognized the rasping cat's tongue voice from Elinor's library. "And a person can very easily get shot trespassing on private property at night." "I can explain." Dustfinger leaned over Elinor's shoulder. "Well, well, who have we here, if it isn't Dustfinger?" The man withdrew the barrel of his gun. "Do you have to turn up in the middle of the night?" Elinor turned and cast Dustfinger a glance that was more than suspicious. "I'd no idea you were on such friendly terms with these people," she commented. "You called them devils." But Dustfinger was already out of the car, and Maggie didn't like the familiar way the two men were talking. She remembered exactly what Dustfinger had said to her about Capricorn's men. How could he talk to one of them like this? However hard Maggie strained her ears, she couldn't make out what the pair was saying. She caught only one thing. Dustfinger called the stranger Basta. "I don't like this," whispered Elinor. "Look at the pair of them. They're talking to each other as if our matchstick-eating friend can come and go here as he likes." That's what I keep saying, Dustfinger acts like these people are evil and horrible, and yet at the same time he's acting as if he knows them intimately and is on very good terms with them, and that they're not as evil as he makes them out to be. He's basically a walking contradiction. He probably knows they won't hurt him because we're bringing them the book, Maggie whispered back, never taking her eyes off the two men. The stranger had a couple of dogs with him, German shepherds. They were sniffing Dustfinger's hands and nuzzling him in the ribs, wagging their tails. "See that?" hissed Elinor. "Even those dogs treat him like an old friend. Suppose—" But before she could say any more, Basta opened the driver's door. "Get out, both of you," he ordered. Reluctantly, Elinor swung her legs out of the car. Maggie got out too and stood beside her. Her heart was thudding. She had never seen a man with a gun before. Well, on TV she had, but not in real life. "Look, I don't like your tone," Elinor informed Basta. "We've had a strenuous drive, and we only came to this godforsaken spot to bring your boss, or whatever you call him, something he's been wanting for a long time. So let's have a little more civility." "Elinor, shut up!" Basta cast her such a scornful glance that Elinor drew in a sharp breath, and Maggie involuntarily squeezed her hand. "Where did you pick her up?" inquired Basta, turning back to Dustfinger, who was standing there looking as unmoved as if none of this had anything to do with him. "She owns that house. You know the one I mean." Dustfinger had lowered his voice, but Maggie heard him all the same. "I didn't want to bring her, but she insisted." "I can imagine that." Basta scrutinized Elinor once again, then turned to Maggie. "So, this is Silvertongue's little daughter. Doesn't look much like him." "Where's my father?" asked Maggie. "How is he?" These were the first words she had managed to utter. Her voice was hoarse, as if she hadn't used it for a long time. "Oh, he's fine," replied Basta, glancing at Dustfinger. "Although he's saying so little at the moment that Leaden Tongue would be more like it." Maggie bit her lip. "We've come for him," she said. Now her voice was high and thin, although she was trying as hard as she could to sound grown up. "We have the book, but we won't give it to Capricorn unless he lets my father go." "Maggie, you're 12. Do you really think you're in a position to bargain?" Basta turned to Dustfinger again. "Something about her does remind me of her father after all. See her lips tighten? And that look. Oh yes, anyone can see they're related." His voice sounded as if he were joking, but there was nothing funny about his face when he looked at Maggie again. It was thin, sharply angular, with close-set eyes. He narrowed them slightly, as if he could see better that way. Basta was not a tall man, and his shoulders were almost as narrow as a boy's, but Maggie held her breath when he took a step toward her. She was afraid of him. She had never been so afraid of anyone before, and it wasn't because of the shotgun in his hand. He had an aura of fury about him, of something keen and biting. Well, first of all, she should be afraid, because, with all the stories she's been told about him and all, he's a scary guy. But also, she's saying she's never been so afraid of someone before in her life or whatever. Well, she was awfully afraid of Dustfinger earlier, so from the descriptions of how she's feeling and reacting so far, sounds just like when Dustfinger was lurking outside her window, so, I don't know, whatever. "Maggie, get the bag out of the trunk." As Basta was about to grab Maggie, Elinor pushed herself between them. "There's nothing dangerous in it," she said crossly, "just what we came here to hand over." By way of answer, Basta pulled the dogs aside, yanking on their leashes so harshly that they yelped out loud. "Maggie, listen to me," whispered Elinor as they left the car and followed Basta down a steep pathway leading to the lighted windows. "Don't hand over the book until they let us see your father. Understand?" Maggie nodded. clutching the plastic bag firmly to her chest. How stupid did Elinor think she was? On the other hand, how was she going to hang on to the book if Basta decided to take it away from her? She preferred not to follow this line of thinking through to its conclusion. It was a hot, sultry night. The sky above the black hills was sprinkled with stars. The path down which Basta was leading them was stony and so dark that Maggie could hardly see her own feet, but whenever she stumbled there was a hand to catch her. The hand belonged to either Elinor, walking beside her, or to Dustfinger, who was following as silently as if he were her shadow. Gwyn was still in his backpack, and Basta's dogs kept raising their noses and sniffing, as if they had picked up the sharp scent of the marten. Slowly they came closer to the lighted windows. Maggie saw old houses of gray, rough-hewn stone, with a pale church tower rising above the rooftops. Many of the houses looked empty as they passed, going down alleyways so narrow that Maggie felt they could close in on her. Some of the houses had no roofs. Others were little more than a couple of walls partly fallen in. It was dark in Capricorn's village. Only a few lamps were on in the streets, hanging from masonry arches above the alleyways. At last they reached a small square. The church with the tower they had seen from a distance stood on one side of the square, and not far away, divided from it by a narrow hallway, there was a large two-story house which did not look at all derelict. This square was better lit than the rest of the village, with 4 lanterns casting menacing shadows on the paving stones. Basta led them straight to the big house, where more light showed behind 3 windows on the upper floor. Was Mo in there? Maggie listened to herself as if she could find the answer there, but all her heart would tell her was a tale of fear and grief. So that's the end of that chapter. I thank you for joining me, and I hope you'll join me next time. And I'm sorry about the lighting change and the camera change and all. I'd gotten a phone call earlier and I had to stop the recording. So when I set everything back up, it was slightly different, and I can't help that. I'm sorry, but I hope you'll join me next time, and hope you have a great day. Bye!